Inevitably, we've reached that part of the lifespan of the First Descendant, arguably a little bit quicker than I thought we would, of people asking whether the game is dead, whether the game has legs, has longevity, and is able to continue on with the momentum that it had at the very beginning. Now, me personally, as a almost 1,000-hour no-lifer and content creator for the game, I of course have my own thoughts on this, so we're going to discuss this a little bit today. But instead of this devolving into a yes, it's dead, we don't have anything to do or anything like that kind of discussion, I kind of wanted to frame it into three different sections, if you will. The first one being just a general overview of the state of the game, at least my impression of it, and then secondly we can talk about the player base and sort of what there's left to do in the game, and then last but not least, I think the more interesting category, which is definitely something that I look forward to, is of course the future of the game. So firstly, discussing the state of the game, the First Descendant launched on the 2nd of July in 2024, and in my opinion actually launched incredibly stable. I think this is an opinion shared by quite a few people, and also launched in a very opportune time for a game like this, which is a looter shooter in a games as a service shell. And basically there wasn't really anything else at the time that was new and that can compete for the attention of, you know, new eyeballs on a product. The fact that it simultaneously launched on PC and console meant that you had a huge amount of players playing this, and its first couple of days were massive. I think this maybe is the only criticism that I would offer at this particular point in time, and that is of course that the game launched into a fairly long preseason, and the developers themselves put a lot of content into that preseason. Players obviously chewed through this content a lot faster than I think the developers expected them to, and this is further on hampered by the fact that while players were playing through the game, certain things like outpost timers and, you know, cooldowns on certain things and just general things which were slowing players' progress were some of the most complained about topics. This in turn followed by the developer adjusting these things, kind of alleviating some of the strain off the players, which meant that these players were just pushing through this content even quicker. So the problem that we have right now is that while we're currently in season right now, you are starting to see player burnout, you're starting to see players moving on, complaining that there's nothing to do. We're going to talk about this a little bit more just now, but just in general, the state right now seems to be what we see quite commonly in games like this, where you have an insanely high peak, and then as soon as that peak starts dropping off, people start looking at things like Steam charts, they start looking at general content about the game being made online, and this tends to sort of hit like a negative-ish slant. If you're a content creator for this game, we tend to spot this a little bit sooner, I would imagine, and that's simply because of the fact that you can just gauge, if you're very attentive to the kind of comments that you get on your videos, that it's starts to kind of become a little bit more negative, and people start to have a little bit more fatigue towards the game, wondering whether something is worth it, whether they should do it, they don't have anything else to do, yada yada. So just to frame the conversation a little bit, we can of course open up the dreaded Steam charts for the First Descendant. I hate to do it, I'm sure you guys have seen this information before, but the bottom line is, using 1 month as a sample size here, we can of course see that the numbers are slowly but surely dwindling for the First Descendant. Of course, it's super important to mention that this is only indicative of the PC people playing on Steam, and of course doesn't take into account people that are playing it on PlayStation and Xbox. And you can generally take these numbers and you can, 2x it, 1.5x it, and that's going to give you generally a good idea of who's playing it on console as well. It might even be higher. It's a little bit more difficult to get that because we don't have something like Steam charts specifically for console. Now, that being said, again, we see that the numbers are slowly but surely going down, and this usually sets off these kinds of videos and these talking points on Reddit, on YouTube, and so on, of people saying like, "Oh my God, the game's dying, game's dead, abandon it, look for life rafts, so on and so forth." But just specifically, and I hate to do that, but what about? But if we look at just Diablo 4, for example, and we look at the last month of Diablo 4, as Diablo 4 is getting ready for a new expansion to come out, you can see this is also slowly but surely dripping as well. Of course, Diablo 4 is also available on Diablo launch and everything, so I know we're just looking at the Steam numbers, but there you go. It kind of looks the same. And then if we look at Path of Exile, whoa, lo and behold, you can kind of see the same thing. Path of Exile is also slowly but surely just going down, and you see these sort of up downs, and that's basically as people are just jumping in and doing their dailies and that sort of thing. So this is not something new. This is something that is in all games like this, games as a service, games that have dailies, weeklies and stuff like that, patches and so on, that are not one-off story player games, you will see this sort of thing happen. And it's incredibly natural for the game to do that. It's virtually impossible to hit those numbers that you hit right at the beginning, because this is when something is brand new and this is when it's getting a lot of hype and all of that. And I think this is generally understood by a lot of people. However, I think that when you see something like this is of course something that you can, you know, discuss, and that you can sort of like hype or make a problem out of something that potentially might not be a problem. This is not to say that I'm glazing the game and saying that the First Descendant is infallible and will always be around and will never fail. Of course, these things can happen. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is we're far too early in this whole thing to call games being dead and all of that. It's weird though, because also if you are someone who has played as many hours as, for example, I have, or I'm sure as many of the people that are watching this video right now has, it kind of makes it feel as if the game has been out for longer than it has, but it actually hasn't, and it is relatively in almost its infancy. Speaking of the player base, we also have to consider that there are various camps of people that are of course enjoying this game. First and foremost, people that talk about this game online are by far the vocal minority, and this is true for every single game. So while we have places like Reddit where this game can be discussed, you have YouTube and so on, it's important to remember that this is representative of a very small population, or let's rather say a very small size of the population that actually currently play the First Descendant. Just the same way as someone who has mastery rank 25 and has like 1,000 hours in the game is pretty much within the less than 5%, probably less than 2% of the population that play this game. But these are the kinds of people that might potentially feel now that they have run out of things to do, because they might have also come to the realization that it doesn't matter how many guns you level up to max rank, how many descendants you do to max rank, there are only a handful of bosses, and arguably only really one boss that you can test your min-max top of the food chain stuff against, and that of course means that you might feel that you don't have anything to do. Now, for just reference, I, with the stats that I have and with an MR ranking of 25, still have a ton of stuff that I want to and can do in this game. But again, I am part of a very small group as well, because I'm a content creator that enjoys the game, and so therefore I kind of like win on two sides, because I'm making content for a game that I enjoy playing, and at the same time I'm able to put that content onto the internet, and I'm able to get views, and I'm able to get people to basically watch that and then become a fan of the channel. At least that's what we hope and how it works. That being said, the player base itself will also sort of naturally fix itself to this. You see this a lot with, I guess I'll use a game like Path of Exile, since I know a lot of people who play Path of Exile, and that you often, these are people who are the staunchest defenders of Path of Exile, and within those first couple of weeks of a new season coming out, have nothing but good to say about it and love it. I like it a lot. And fucking play 12 hours a day, and then suddenly as soon as they reach their goal for the season, they fall off and they go away. The same thing will happen for this game, and it's something that it sometimes feels as if players need to learn anew every time, that they need to realize that it is okay to step away from the game, and it is okay, especially since it is a seasonal model game, to approach it in that way and to say, okay, cool, well, I'm not going to be engrossed for the entire 90 days of the season, but it's more going to be like a 20, 25 days, 30 days, and then I'm going to move on with something else. If we look at something like this, which is of course just the achievement score on Steam, you can see that arguably I would say the achievement that is the most indicative of how far players have progressed with the game is Slot Maketh Module, which is assign module socket types 10 times. And only 5.7% of the Steam player base has actually achieved this achievement. And that should be very, very indicative to you of how far players in general have actually pushed into the late game mechanics, aka leveling a character fully or a weapon fully, and therefore the complaints that we are hearing about there not being anything to do or so on is very literally coming from an extremely small vocal minority. I think it also matters that you need to decide, or not need to decide, but I think it also matters that some people view being done with a game differently than others. I, for example, approach a game like this in the case of like, I will basically want to do every single thing that there is in it. So craft every single weapon and test it, try every different build, try budget builds, min-max builds, and all of that stuff.
Stop it. Get some help.
But that's thousands and thousands of hours eventually when all the chips are on the table. Whereas somebody else views this game as a one and done perspective, meaning they pick a gun they like, they pick a character they like, they go as far as they can, and as soon as they hit their head against some heavy content or something that makes them feel like, this isn't respecting my time or something, they move on. The point, I guess, that I'm trying to make with this entire discussion is that we're not seeing anything new with the First Descendant. In fact, this video and me talking about this isn't anything new. I'm sure there's a ton of other creators that have done exactly the same thing, and there's a ton of other people that feel exactly the same way. But every time we enter this part of the life cycle of a game like the First Descendant, or pretty much any games as a service, these are the kinds of topic points and conversations that come up. And in some cases, those games generally do have a problem, and that problem needs to be addressed. But in some cases it isn't, and it's more just this natural attrition of players and so on. When we look to the future of the game, however, I think it's also very important that we temper our expectations. I think there's a massive amount of copium happening in the community right now. I see a lot of posts, I see a lot of videos of people saying that the only thing that matters is we need to make it to October. As soon as we get that big patch, it's gonna be a game changer. It's gonna bring everybody back. It's gonna be, back like when it was launched and so on. Because of course we're getting Ultimate Freyna and we're getting a vendor that allows us to trade materials that we have duplicates of into, and we're getting some other changes and things like that. I don't think that this is the case at all.
Fuck you.
Will there be players that will be coming back for these activities and for Ultimate Freyna and for the vendor and so on? Yeah, sure. But the point is, these people are still coming back to basically one Descendant, which you can now again level against the same content. So the same things that were frustrating them before are still going to be present. And I'm sure that the developer is going to change some things, like the changes they made to King's Lance and the changes that they are probably going to make to some other Descendants, which will switch the game up a little bit and get you to try new things, but the core loop is still going to be there. And I feel like this is the thing that a lot of people are bumping their heads against, because the core loop of the First Descendant is not trying to see if you can kill gluttony. The core loop of the First Descendant is leveling up Descendants and leveling up modules and leveling up weapons. And it's almost in a way like a gotta collect them all and gotta level them all. And people will probably disagree with me about this, but that is where you can see the meat and potatoes of the game. That is where the massive amounts of playtime that you're going to spend with this game actually reside. The point is, a boss like Gluttony and the new boss, which we're going to be getting, which I forgot to mention, which is also coming in October, allow a very, let's say, select player base portion to actually challenge that. We can see that Gluttony is still one of the most difficult bosses for most players to fight, and I know a handful of people that have simply never progressed past that part and actually also aren't interested in doing it because of its relevant difficulty and just not wanting to mess around with mechanics and stuff like that. Of course, what will happen is Gluttony's difficulty will be bumped down, much like we saw happening with Frostwalker, and so now more people will play that, and Deathstalker, which is the new boss, will basically be the new Gluttony. So I think it's, again, just to paraphrase here and just to maybe repeat myself a little bit, I think it's important that we realize that if you have a problem with the First Descendant and with the game and with the loop and everything like that, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I don't think the first week or the second week in October is going to solve any of those problems for you. But what I do have is some, I guess, advice, and that is that it is okay to actually consume this game in bite-sized chunks. The problem with games as a service and games like this is the FOMO feeling that you get, because when you're not playing it, you're losing out on potential XP, weapon proficiency, you could be unlocking this, you could be doing that. And this is further on magnified by the fact that if you're bombarded by content of things like that, as well as potentially maybe friends and groups that you play in that are reaching those things, that it just ends up feeling like a fucking chore or a job for you to do. And in those most cases, I would say walk away from that. Don't treat it that way, because in a way you're already just setting yourself up for failure. I don't mean that in a harsh way. I just mean that it's probably going to end up frustrating you, and that's not the reason why we play games. We play games to enjoy them. And that's basically the point that I'm trying to make here. That being said, I could have done this whole video on stream and everything like that, but I wanted to do it in this way because I wanted to have it be a little bit more structured and so on. But I do want you guys to give me your opinions in the comments as well, and tell me where you are at mentally in terms of like the First Descendant. Are you hopeful that things are going to get a lot better down the line? I personally think that while October, you know, the second week in October is not this, you know, Hail Mary that everybody views it to be, I believe the game is on an insanely good trajectory. I think it had a very stable launch compared to some of its contemporaries, and that means that it has set itself up in a way that if the developer is as fluid as they've shown themselves to be, and they continue on to do this, season 2, 3, 4 and everything like that will continue to actually up the quality of this game. And I think there's a very, very bright future here for us. Nonetheless, let me know how you feel about that, how much you're looking forward to the stuff that's coming out in October. Are you on an indefinite break, or are you still enjoying the game? Other than that, it's just super important to me that you have a fantastic morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. Till next video, fucking cheers.